Thank you, Stephanie. Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Landheis, and I am the director of SPARC. I appreciate all of you participating right away in our poll. We just asked you to let us know which discipline you represent, and it looks like a majority of you are advocates. And for those of you that voted other, I saw folks mention that they're legal aid attorneys, criminal court advocates, working on campus communities as far as reporting. So thank you all for participating. That's helpful for me to know as we spend the next hour together. So you can go ahead and take that poll down, Stephanie. Thank you. As I mentioned, my name is Jennifer Landheis. I'm the director of SPARC, which is the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. We are funded by the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women to provide training and technical assistance specific to the issue of stalking. And if you're not familiar with us, I would highly encourage you to check out our website. And we provide the following services. Under normal circumstances, we do in-person trainings. We do webinars as well. We have tons of online resources, so I would encourage you after this webinar or even during the webinar to get on our website and check out our resources. We offer individual and organizational assistance, so if the organization that you work for is interested in improving your response to stalking, please reach out to us. We also provide policy and protocol development and consultation. So if you're interested in enhancing your ability to work with stalking victims and you want to come up with policies for your particular discipline, please reach out to us. We're more than happy to help you, as well as the fact that SPARC is in charge of National Stalking Awareness Month, which is the month of January. So we have awareness materials on our website that you're welcome to use year-round to promote stalking awareness and help people identify that you're a resource in their community for them to be able to reach out to. Our website is stalkingawareness.org, and on that website we have several things that I would like to point out to all of you on the phone. The first is that we have training modules available. So if you are responsible for doing training in your community, either training for local community members or professionals, we have modules on stalking, so you can get on there and download them. And they have the PowerPoint, they have a training script, they have all the videos that we would use. Pretty much it's a training in a box. So you're more than welcome to get on there and download it. And we would encourage you to do so and use it so that you can help spread awareness throughout your community. We also have victim resources available on our website. One of the things that's important to note is that SPARC does not provide services to victims directly. So please do not encourage victims to call out to us, because we in turn direct them to reach out to all of you. So we provide training and technical assistance to all of you that are helping stalking victims, but we don't work with victims directly. We also have practitioner guides on the website. So if you are a prosecutor, if you're a corrections officer, if you're an advocate, there's guides on the website about how to advocate for victims of stalking, how do we prosecute stalking crimes. So check out all that information. Today's webinar is going to be recorded and we post it on our website. So if you get on our website, we have training archives and you can listen to previously recorded webinars, and we'd encourage you to do so. If you want to listen to this one, it takes us about a week to get it up on the website, so look for that later next week, and you can share that with your colleagues. And then we'd encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. Our newsletter highlights new information that's coming out about stalking, lets you know of our newly developed resources. And then last but not least, we would encourage you to follow us on social media. And if you appreciate my sense of humor, our username on all of our social media is Follow Us Legally. So reach out to us, follow us on social media. We'd love to interact with you. And it's a great way to stay up to date on all the new resources that we're providing. So we're going to start off this morning just spending, I guess it's afternoon for a lot of us, we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about the definitions of stalking. Because we provide training all across the country, we don't stick to just the statutory definition of stalking, because even though every state has a definition and a statutory definition about stalking, they all differ. But instead, we use what we call the behavioral definition of stalking. And that definition is that it's a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So for us to consider something to be a pattern of behavior, we say that that is 2 or more incidents. And then we say it's directed at a specific person, but one of the things that we know is that stalking often spills over to other people besides the primary victim. So it's not unusual to work on a stalking case where the stalking victim is the primary victim, and then the stalking starts to spill over into somebody that's important to the victim. So a family member, a friend, a coworker. And then the last part of the definition says that it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And that's one of the pieces that we really want to spend a little bit of time talking about, because what we know is that fear can be really subjective. And in stalking cases, the other thing that we know is that context is extremely critical to understanding stalking cases, because something might be frightening to the victim, but it's not frightening to the rest of us that are responders. And so sometimes victims come forward and file for civil protection orders, or they come in for safety planning, or they make a report to law enforcement, and they're reporting a behavior that seems kind of benign to the rest of us, that we don't understand why that would be scary. It seems like it's not a big deal, but we have to keep in mind that for stalking victims, a lot of times those behaviors have specific meaning to the victim, and the offender knows that. And so it might not mean anything to the rest of us on the outside, but it definitely means something to victims. And so one of the things to talk about when you consider safety planning with victims is to ask them, what did that mean to you? So you got a card in the mail, or the offender sent you a text message, or they drove by a specific location. What did that particular behavior mean to you? What did you think was going to happen next? Because that helps us enhance our ability to be able to safety plan with survivors. The other thing that we know about stalking is that it criminalizes otherwise non-criminal behavior, which makes it kind of hard when we look at the criminal justice system. So one of the things that we know is that sometimes in criminal justice system response, we are very what we call incident-based, meaning that we are looking at one particular thing that has happened, and we are interacting with victims or survivors because of that one incident. And so what we oftentimes fail to do is expand beyond that one incident to look at the entire picture or the course of conduct that's happening in these particular cases. And so we might have a victim who calls law enforcement because the offender is driving down the street outside of her house. And perhaps law enforcement has responded and said, it's a public street. That person can drive down that public street. And if we only focus our response on particular incidents and we don't necessarily back up and look at the entire picture of everything that's happening, we oftentimes miss the fact that these are stalking crimes. So what we hear from victims over and over and over again is that we will have one particular incident that they've reported to law enforcement, that they've come in to seek a civil protection order for, and when we're interacting with that person, we're focused just on that particular incident. And what we know is stalkers vary their behavior all the time. So keep in mind that one of the things you need to consider is that when we are looking at these particular incidents, we have to consider all of the behaviors that might happen in a stalking crime. So keeping that in mind as we move forward is really important. The other thing that we need to consider is the prevalence of stalking. So what we know is that in a one-year period of time, about 5 million women and about 2 million men experience stalking, which breaks down to about 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men that experience stalking in their lifetime. And those statistics are higher than a lot of people presume them to be. Sometimes people say, well, does stalking really happen that often? I have lots of those of us that are in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault. Those individuals say to me, well, we don't work with stalking victims as much because it doesn't happen as often. And what the statistics would actually tell you is that stalking is happening as often. But for some reason, we're not seeing those individuals either through the criminal justice system, through the civil justice system, or through our interactions in advocacy agencies. So keeping that in mind, if we're not seeing that many individuals come in, but we then know the statistics are that high, what does that mean? Unfortunately, it means probably that we aren't identifying stalking as it happens and that victims aren't reaching out to us. So how do we improve our ability to be able to interact with victims and identify stalking when it's happening? The other thing that we know is that 18 to 24-year-olds experience the highest rate of stalking, which is not surprising given the fact that 18 to 24-year-olds are often in the process of engaging in new relationships. They might be trying to figure out what's healthy, what's unhealthy. They may be dating. We also know that 18 to 24-year-olds don't have fully developed brains, and so they might not know the difference between what's appropriate behavior, what's not appropriate behavior. And we know that women are more likely to experience stalking, but even when we have male victims, we oftentimes have male offenders. That happens because we have a male offender who's stalking a female victim, and the female victim moves on and gets into a new relationship, and the offender starts stalking that new boyfriend. So keep in mind, when we have male victims of stalking, in about half the time we have a female offender, and the other half of the time we have a male offender. So keep that in mind. And then, of course, we obviously know that a majority of victims know the offender somehow. So, Stephanie, I can see you chatting that a few attendees are complaining of static. Is that getting any better for folks? Okay. Some of you are typing in that if you call in instead of using your computer audio. Adobe obviously is having lots of traffic right now, so it could be that if you're calling in, you'll have a better reception than if you're just using your computer speakers, because there's thousands of people across the country who are using the Adobe platform right now. So keep in mind that you might just want to call in. It might be a little bit easier. So back to the victim and offender relationship, one of the things that we can be thinking about is that many stalking relationships are centered around a current or former intimate partner stalker who is stalking the victim. We also know that not all of them are current or former intimate partner violence cases. So keep in mind that we also have stalkers who are acquaintances or strangers. So not all victims of stalking are in domestic violence relationships. And one of the things that we need to consider is, what does our response look like if the victim is not in an intimate partner relationship? Unfortunately, what we've found around the country is a lot of our stalking response is seated in our domestic violence response, which is great because we've made a lot of really good strides in our domestic violence response. But one of the things that we need to keep thinking about is, what about all those victims, about 50%, who aren't in a domestic violence relationship, who are being stalked by an acquaintance or a stranger? How do those people know that they're a victim of stalking? Where do they turn to for help? Would they qualify for services? Say, for instance, if they call the domestic violence or sexual assault program, or if they tried for a civil protection order. So keep in mind that we've made some really great strides in our response to victims of stalking, but we also have to think about, who are we missing? And I would guarantee that even within domestic violence situations, we're still not reaching every victim of stalking who's experiencing stalking within the context of domestic violence. So let's talk a little bit about some of the stalking behavior that happens in these particular cases. One of the things that we know is, oftentimes when we're talking about stalking, people have a tendency to focus on the surveillance piece of things. So how is the offender showing up? How are they monitoring the victim's behaviors, either online or in person? But stalking is more than that. And in fact, there's a really great model put out by Dr. T.K. Logan at the University of Kentucky that focuses on what we call the SLIl strategies. And SLIl stands for surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, and interference through sabotage or attack. So one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that when we look at stalking situations, it's more than just the surveillance piece of things. But what we know oftentimes is that when we're interacting with victims of stalking, we don't necessarily ask about all those other things that have been happening. And in fact, what we know is lots of victims of stalking will not even identify that they're a victim of stalking. So the research will tell us that when we ask victims, are you a victim of stalking, many times they'll say no. But if we say, has somebody been monitoring your social media? Is somebody showing up unexpectedly? Is somebody sending you text messages that you don't want? Then victims say yes. Well, all of those behaviors might be part of a stalking situation, but unless we're specifically identifying them or talking about them, victims aren't identifying them as well either. So one of the things that we have to be really well versed in is understanding all the behaviors that happen in stalking situations, because if we don't ask about them, victims won't volunteer that information, and we may miss some of the necessary components that we need to either build a criminal case or even more so to be able to safety plan with the victims that we're working with. So here's some examples of some of the things that make up the SLIl strategies. So when we talk about surveillance, that's usually the one that people are the most familiar with. It can be things like following someone or watching or waiting, showing up unexpectedly. You also see the term proxy stalking there, and proxy stalking stands for using someone else to facilitate the stalking. So you might have an offender who's been court-ordered to stay away from the victim, and now the offender is using their brother, their best friend, another family member to engage in the stalking behavior, and that person is the person that's gathering information or engaging in these behaviors. The second strategy that we see is what we call life invasion, and that's things like unwanted contact at home or phone calls. It's public humiliation, forcing confrontations, harassing friends and family of the victim. Life invasion is something that happens really frequently in stalking cases, but if you just look at the examples that are, for instance, up on your screen, many of those particular tactics are not criminal events, and they only become criminal when we look at them within the context of the larger situation. And so one of the things to think about is when we're working with stalking victims, many times we have individual incidents that in and of themselves are not criminal behaviors, and it isn't until we look at the entire full picture that we have established that a stalking crime is happening. And that's really important when we talk about safety planning, because many times victims will not identify that they're experiencing some of these particular behaviors. And so we can't safety plan around something that we don't even know about. The other thing that we can be thinking about is the interference piece of things. So that's when offenders are sabotaging work or financial situations. For instance, we were working and consulting on a case where the victim was a realtor, and she had a prominent website that the offender had gotten on and ruined her reviews and made her reputation really poor in the community. And so it also ruined her livelihood. And when that first began happening and the victim was reporting it, it wasn't necessarily seen as a criminal event. And it wasn't until we started looking at all the other things that were happening to this particular victim that it was determined that there was stalking happening. Though looking at just that one particular thing that happened led to a lot of misinformation, a lot of frustration on the victim's standpoint, who was absolutely seeing the impact on this particular activity on their life, but not necessarily feeling like they had any recourse either through the criminal or civil court system. The other things that we see happen, and the final one, is intimidation. And a lot of you know that that is pretty familiar because you see it often in domestic violence situations where there's forced confrontations, where the offender might threaten to hurt themselves or someone else, or there's property damage. And what we see sometimes in stalking cases is there's vandalism or property damage to the stalking victim's car or house, and they contact law enforcement, and it's viewed as a property crime. And law enforcement might ask the victim, do you know who did this to your car? Do you know who slashed your tires? And victims say, yeah, I know, it was my ex-boyfriend. We don't have any proof that it was the ex-boyfriend. They go and talk to the ex-boyfriend. The ex-boyfriend says, no, I wasn't the person doing this. The victim knows, and in fact, the police might even believe the victim. But we view it just as a property crime, and there's no additional follow-up. No one flags it as part of a stalking situation, and so we miss the opportunity to do an intervention. And victims get frustrated because they say, well, I called the police and nothing happened. So keep in mind, one of the things we have to think about when we're looking at safety planning and interventions to stalking crimes is we have to look at that full picture. And so understanding how these SLIl behaviors happen, the surveillance, the life invasion, the intimidation, and the interference is really important. This particular victim says, what I'm left with is always the same, that he has bled the assumption of innocent coincidence right out of my life, and his final gift to me is a life of not knowing. This particular victim was describing how it seems for her on an everyday basis where She no longer believes in coincidences. If the offender happens to show up, it's not a coincidence. She knows that the offender knows where she's been at this particular moment in time. And so living with that hypervigilance can cause a lot of emotional impact and damage to victims who are experiencing these situations. And so keep in mind when we talk about the SLIl strategies, the other thing that we need to be thinking about is how those play out. And they usually play out in what we refer to as the DIF pattern. So when you look at stalking situations, it's really important to assess the duration, the intensity, and the frequency. So duration is just how long the incidents have been happening. We know that for lots of victims, the average duration of a stalking case is about 2 years. And the intensity, how often things are happening, but also how intense they are, like how many of these strategies are invading every aspect of the victim's life, as well as the frequency. So how often are they happening? Are they happening once a week? Are they happening once a month? And what we know is that lots of offenders use a variety of tactics. And so one of the things we have to be keeping in mind is when we look at offenders' behavior, oftentimes what happens is we safety plan around what's currently happening. So for instance, if the victim's getting numerous phone calls or numerous text messages, well-intended criminal justice folks and advocates might say to a victim, have you thought about changing your phone number? But let's put that into place. So if we have a victim who's getting phone calls or text messages or voicemails from the offender and they change their phone number, the next time the offender calls and gets the I'm sorry, this number has been disconnected message, does the offender just say, oh, I guess I'm done stalking the person, they've changed their phone number, I have to be done? That's completely ludicrous. That doesn't happen. So what we sometimes do is when we're safety planning with victims, we end up suggesting things and it doesn't stop the stalking. The stalker just changes their behavior. And what we know is that 78% of stalkers use more than one means of approach. So if we suddenly cut off telephone access or we say to victims, you should get off of social media, not something I would highly recommend. We're going to talk about that in a second. The offender doesn't just stop their behavior. They oftentimes, in fact, will escalate it. So if we cut off contact by phone, the offender knows where the victim works. They know where they go to school. They know how to access them, so they just show up in person. And so what we end up doing a lot of times is actually escalating the level of violence in the situation because now we've moved from just phone contact to in-person contact. And we've problem solved around one particular thing that's happened and safety planned around that, and the offender just switches their tactics. So when we look at safety planning for stalking victims, one of the really important things to be thinking about is that offenders change their behavior all the time. And so if we're really looking to enhance safety in stalking situations, we have to consider how do we assess these particular situations. And Dr. Logan, who came up with the SLIl strategies, has a framework for assessing stalking, and it looks at the intentional course of conduct that's happening in these cases. So it analyzes all the different SLIl strategies that have been happening. It looks at the DIF patterns, how often it's been happening, how intense it is. And then it also looks at the victim's fear and looking at both implicit and explicit threats, as well as the context of those threats, and how unwanted the behavior is. Has the victim let the offender know that the behavior is unwanted, and is the stalker still persisting? Is there a civil protection order in place that the offender is just violating over and over again? And so as we assess these situations, it's important to know that victims are actually most afraid of not knowing what's going to happen next. Lots of people assume, mistakenly, that victims are most afraid of the offender. And while they're certainly afraid of the offender, oftentimes their biggest fear is not knowing what's going to happen next. Where is the offender going to show up? What are they going to do? Now that I'm not on social media, what's going to happen? So keeping in mind that sometimes we safety plan and we encourage victims to get off of social media or change their phone number, and that's not actually a great strategy because what it does is just isolate victims further, and then the offender just changes their tactics. They don't stop the stalking. So keep in mind that one of the things that we have to be thinking about is not only safety planning about the behaviors that are happening right now, but what might happen in the future, because victims need information. And so talking with victims about all those SLIl strategies, this is what the offender might do. Have you thought about this particular situation? Helps empower victims to make choices that can hopefully enhance their safety, but also puts them in contact with resources. So keep that in mind as well. The other thing that we hear in lots of stalking cases is well-intended criminal justice folks and advocates who say, well, if the victim would just stop contacting the offender, it would make our lives a lot easier. Or we hear people say, well, if the victim was really afraid, why does the victim continue to have contact with the offender? And what we know is that absolutely in stalking cases, we want to recommend to victims that they disengage, if at all possible. Because, say for instance, if the offender calls the victim 36 times, and on the 37th time, the victim answers and they only say, leave me alone, I'm going to report you to police, and they hang up, the next time the offender calls, they call 37 times. So even that intermittent reinforcement, if it's to pick up the phone and tell the offender to pound sand or leave them alone, that intermittent reinforcement still is reinforcement to the offender. So if at all possible, completely disengaging from the offender is the best strategy. But we have to realize that victims oftentimes are engaging with the offenders because they're safety planning. The more they know about the offender's state of mind, what their behavior is like, how they're feeling about the victim, the better they are able to safety plan. Many of us have heard that old adage, you keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Many victims of stalking are engaging with the offender because they're gathering information that can help them safety plan. So we have to keep in mind that all of us that do domestic violence work have done a really great job about being able to explain the dynamics that happen in stalking cases, or that happen in domestic violence cases, but we're not as great about being able to explain those same dynamics when they play out in stalking cases. And so we have to keep in mind that it isn't always possible for the victim to completely disengage with the offender, especially if they have children in common. Sometimes we're court ordering them to keep in contact because there's custody things in place. So keep all of that in mind as we move forward, because it's really great to be able to have that conversation with victims and say, look, if you can possibly disengage, that's great. If you have contact with the offender, know that that might reinforce their behavior, and it also makes it hard for the criminal justice system. So if you're having contact with the offender, we just need to know why, so that we can be able to explain that, so that we understand that you're safety planning that particular moment in time. So just because victims of stalking are having contact with the offenders doesn't mean we no longer have a stalking case. We hear that from frustrated criminal professionals all across the country who say, oh, well, if the victim's having contact with the offender, it's no longer a stalking case. Yes, it absolutely is, because many of the victims are having contact because they're afraid for their safety. So when we're working with stalking victims, not only are we looking at the safety component, but we're also considering what kind of advocacy is available to those victims. How do we document some of these situations, and how do we best support victims? So with the safety aspect of things, one of the things we need to be thinking about is some of the basic considerations in safety planning with stalking victims. And the first and foremost one that I think we have a tendency to overlook all the time is trusting victims' instincts. Many victims will say, I know he's going to hurt me. And unfortunately, what happens in a lot of stalking cases is because victims become very hypervigilant to the offender's behaviors, that they're doing lots of things that those of us on the outside who aren't experiencing that terror or aren't worried about our safety might say things like, oh, she's kind of paranoid, or, you know, she kind of seems to overreact to things. We have to remember that we have to trust our victims' instincts. They're always spot on, and that those safety plans and safety concerns that they're bringing up are really important, and safety plans have to evolve. They can't just be focused on one particular SLIl tactic. We have to come to the point where we understand that victims are the best experts in their life. They know what to expect. They many times have insight into the offender that the rest of us don't have. So considering what the stalker's next tactic is important for part of the safety planning, as well as anticipating what the stalker reaction might be. One of the things that we hear all the time is criminal justice professionals recommending to victims of stalking, get a civil protection order. When you might have a victim who says, that's not going to do any good. In fact, that's just going to enrage him further. And if I get a civil protection order, that's really going to set him off. So having conversations with victims when we're safety plan about anticipating what the stalker's reaction might be is really important. As well as understanding in these situations, we have to balance safety with victims' freedom. Some of you I noticed in the chat were saying when we expect victims to get off social media or stop using phones or changing their phone number, we're taking away their freedom and we're asking them to do things that aren't necessarily safe, and it isolates them. So keep in mind that those same things that you might consider help make victims safer are in actuality isolating them even further. So keeping that in mind as you move forward, that it's hard to try to figure out how do we balance safety for a stalking victim, but also ensuring they have freedom. Lots of victims of stalking say, I'm so frustrated because I feel like I can't go anywhere, do anything without the offender being part of my life. And so how do we mitigate and safety plan around some of those particular feelings that victims have in these particular situations? The other thing that I've already touched on a little bit is that we have to keep in mind that the survivor assessment of risk is a vital part of safety planning, and that oftentimes victims will say, I'm very scared that this offender is going to hurt me or kill me, and we might have professionals who are like, it doesn't really seem like it's at that level yet. Victims assessment is always spot on. There is not a single risk assessment tool that exists in this country that does a better job than victims' insight and intuition. So keeping that in mind is really important. So as we safety plan, keep in mind that safety planning is not a noun, it's a verb. It's not a safety plan. It's not a piece of paper that you take out of your bottom left-hand desk drawer and work with victims on. It's an ever-evolving, changing situation. So it identifies practical ways to decrease the risk, but it also helps put victims in contact with resources. So we have to understand that safety planning isn't focused just on the physical harm that might happen, but also on emotional well-being. And I think that's where we fall short a lot of times in our safety planning with stalking victims, is that we have a tendency to think that safety planning is only about, okay, let's get an escort from your work back to your car, and let's make sure that you don't go grocery shopping at this particular store because that's where the offender shops. And we don't spend as much time focused on the emotional well-being of stalking survivors, and that's really important. So when we talk about safety planning and risk assessment, one of the things that we would suggest to you is using a risk assessment to help enhance safety. And lots of folks across the country are familiar with domestic violence assessments, say for instance like the danger assessment by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, the LAP model, the lethality assessment protocol that exists out there. And all of those are really great assessments when it comes to domestic violence. But a lot of assessments miss the mark when it comes to stalking situations. And so while those assessments that I just mentioned do an excellent job in domestic violence situations, and they identify some of the risk factors that occur in stalking situations, it's best practice to use a stalking-specific assessment. And the one that SPARC recommends is an assessment called SHARP. It stands for the Stalking, Harassment, and Risk Profile. And what we've found by doing trainings all over the country for the last several years is that many people are not familiar with a stalking assessment. It's free of charge. You can find it at the URLs that are on your screen, so either at coercivecontrol.org or stalkingrisk.com. And it's written by Dr. Logan, the individual who also came up with the SLIl strategies, and it focuses on a lot of those particular behaviors. So I would highly encourage you, if you are working with stalking victims, to use the SHARP assessment because it does one of two things. Number one, it helps you identify the specific risks that might be happening in this case. And number two, it also helps you in safety planning because it provides safety suggestions based on that particular risk of this particular case. So if you are not familiar with the SHARP assessment, I highly encourage you to get on those particular links and look at the assessment. And if you want to find out more about the assessment, we've done a previous webinar that's recorded on our SPARC website on the SHARP assessment, and you can get on there and listen to the risk assessment. And I would highly encourage you to think about that. So keeping in mind that there's lots of resources out there. If you have specific questions about SHARP, please email me. You'll get my email at the end of this particular webinar. But I would highly encourage you to start using this risk assessment in your safety planning efforts with victims. It's about 45 questions, but it doesn't take longer than like 15 minutes because a lot of it are yes/no questions. And as a third-party person, as a helper, as a criminal justice professional, you can fill this out without having to have the victim fill it out. So it's something you can fill out that can generate that particular risk and safety plan. So consider using that in your safety planning strategies with victims. The other thing that we need to consider when we talk about safety planning is both the victim's life situation and the impact on their social health. So are there particular things about their particular life situation that might make things difficult? So for example, a very timely example, we are getting lots of questions from folks around the field saying, how is the COVID-19 situation impacting victims of stalking? And my answer would be a couple of things. In some ways, it's increasing the threat for victims because victims are at home or in a place where the offender might know where to find them on an everyday basis. We also know that offenders might have more time on their hands, so they might be more creative in the tactics that they're employing. And some of our friends at, say for instance, the National Network to End Domestic Violence has put out some really great information about safety planning and the impact on victims. But what we don't know a lot about is what's the impact been on victims who aren't in an intimate partner situation. We're not hearing a ton from folks in the field. We would surmise, based on our experience and our expertise, that it could certainly impact negatively victim situations because they're stuck at home and they might be isolated, they might not have access to resources, they might not be in their job where they feel safer on an everyday basis. So keep all of those things in mind, as well as the fact when we look at stalking situations, we have to look at stalker-generated risks. So do we have an offender who has past criminal events? Do we have an offender who's tech savvy? Do we have an offender who's part of the criminal justice system? And looking at some of those systemic barriers, is it not possible for our victim to get a civil protection order because they don't meet the qualifications? Because in some states, if you're not related to somebody by a current or former intimate partner relationship, you might not qualify for a civil protection order. And then we have to also consider our levels of confidentiality. Helping victims understand what our role is and what our level of confidentiality is in these particular cases is extremely important, as well as understanding, do we have an offender who's using technology to interrupt the victim's life, to do some of those surveillance behaviors? And so how do we safety plan around those particular things as well? And again, I would give a shout out to our friends at the National Network to End Domestic Violence Safety Net program. They have an excellent resource about technology safety that I'm going to give to you at the end of today's webinar. I would highly encourage you to look at it. It has some really great information, as well as the fact that SPARC does lots of training on the use of technology in these particular situations. We're happy to help you figure out how to problem solve particular situations as they come up. So that's part of the technical assistance that we provide. If you have a particular situation that you're working in and you're wondering, how do I best safety plan with this victim around this particular technology, please send us an email or give us a call, and we're happy to help you safety plan with the victim and figure out how do we best approach these situations. The other thing that we need to be thinking about, and this slide got a little wonky on me, so you can't read it, but I know what's on it. So when we talk about safety planning, some of the steps that we need to think about is first starting where the victim's at. So understanding what the victim has already tried, what they need help doing, and what they're not willing to do. So those are the three questions that I will often encourage people to ask victims of stalking is, what have you already tried? So that we can acknowledge that by the time victims are reaching out to us, they have already tried several strategies for stopping the stalking, and it's not working. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is asking victims, what do you need our help doing? Do you need to know about the process for applying for a civil protection order? Do you need to know who to call in the middle of the night if you're feeling overwhelmed and you need a support system? And then creating a safe place for victims. Unfortunately, one of the things that we hear from stalking victims is that they feel very screened out by those of us that do the work in domestic violence and sexual assault. And as somebody who's done domestic violence and sexual assault work for 22 years, that breaks my heart, and I didn't understand it. And when we started asking more questions, they started saying, well, I didn't even know who to reach out to because my local crisis center is called Family Crisis Center, and I wasn't being stalked by a family member, so I didn't know if I could get services there. Or they've called at 2 o'clock in the morning and gotten a shelter volunteer who might not be, say, for instance, well-versed on the tactics of stalking, and they say they need a safe place to stay because their employer is harassing them, and they don't use the word stalking, and I don't identify that they're a victim of stalking. And the well-intended volunteer who hasn't had a lot of training says, well, our shelters for victims of domestic violence, you could call the homeless shelter for a place to stay. And so considering when we look at the work that we're doing, many of us would say, absolutely, we work with stalking victims. My question would be to you, how do stalking victims know that? If they look at your website, how often is stalking mentioned? Do you have specific resources for stalking victims? Many of us have packets of information that we give out to every victim of stalking, or every victim of domestic violence, or every victim of sexual assault. What about for victims of stalking? Is that same information provided to them? Do we offer support groups? Do we offer or know referrals for mental health professionals who work with stalking victims, who would understand those dynamics? A lot of times we say we're working with victims of stalking, and when it comes down to it, we don't have a lot of resources, nor do we have a lot of training on it. And so keeping in mind, how do we enhance our ability to be able to respond to stalking victims so that they know that we're a safe place for them to reach out for? The third step that you can't see on this slide is focusing on victims' strengths. So understanding that so many victims have been coping with this particular situation for a while and really building upon those strengths, as well as helping victims access resources and referrals. It surprises me, but I guess it shouldn't. When I go give training across the country, oftentimes I'll say to a room full of 100 people, where do you send victims of stalking? And sometimes I get deer in headlights looks, like people like, I don't really know. Other people will say, well, absolutely, we would send them to the local advocacy program. Other folks would say, we're going to send them to the victim witness coordinator. That's at our police department. But how much training have those individuals had? How do they know how to work with stalking victims? Do they have a coordinated response in place? One of the things that we see across the country is many of us have a coordinated response in place for domestic violence and sexual assault. We know exactly what the other professionals are going to do. We know how to coordinate working together. We don't ask victims to tell their stories a bazillion times, and we've got it figured out when it comes to those particular crimes. Why are we not doing the same coordinated response with victims of stalking? Why do we not have CCRs or task forces in place when it comes to stalking? Because these are some of our most lethal cases. Why are we not coordinating in the same way that we do on domestic violence and sexual assault cases? And how are we planning, the last point on here that you can't see, how are we planning for emotional safety? How are we helping victims figure out how can we cope on a day-to-day basis? What are some of those strategies? Are there professionals that I can work with? Can I go see an advocate at the local program? Do they provide a stalking support group? Thinking about all of those options, as well as the fact that lots of folks, when they're working with stalking victims, recommend civil protection orders, which are always certainly a great option, depending on what the victim thinks about them. We know that many times protection orders are only as good as the enforcement, and so we might have victims who are reluctant to call law enforcement. If they're reluctant to call law enforcement, the civil protection order might not be the best process. And we know that lots of stalkers violate civil protection orders when it comes to stalking. About 81% of male victims have the order violated, and about 69% of female victims. Not saying that it's not still a good option, but we have to discuss some of those things with the victims that we're working with to have a good conversation about what they think will best help things. Will the civil protection order enhance safety, or would it perhaps make this situation more dangerous because of the offender's reaction? And then we're going to move on to the advocacy piece of things. So we talked about the safety planning piece of things. How are we also advocating and supporting victims? What we have found is that victims of stalking really need information. They need information about the reporting process. They need information about the justice process, not only criminal justice, but the civil justice process. And they need information that can help them predict and prepare for what might happen next. So talking with victims about all those different SLIl strategies that have happened and what might happen, and being able to safety plan around those. providing resources for victims if they feel overwhelmed or need to reach out for folks, because that information can help them prepare and predict what might happen in these particular situations. And I think that advocacy piece of things is sometimes what we miss in stalking situations, is we are so focused on the safety planning piece of things, which is absolutely vital, but we forget how do we also provide ongoing support for victims of stalking who are experiencing the stalking for years and years. So how do we continue to support those victims? As well as understanding how can we help victims document everything that's been happening. When we talk about safety planning, many victims might look to the criminal justice system. And if they're doing so, how are they documenting what's been happening to them? Many of us have had the experience of telling a stalking victim, keep a journal about what's happening. And then they bring in their journal to law enforcement or someone else, and it's 500 pages of written information about what's been happening to them, and it never gets looked at. Because what we could consider using is what we would call a stalking incident log. This particular log is on our website. It's available in English and Spanish, and it helps provide a really concise way for victims to be able to document what they've been experiencing. So it talks about a description of the incident, the location of the incident, which is really important when it comes to jurisdiction, because we know that stalking oftentimes spills over. So we might have a victim who lives in one jurisdiction, who experiences stalking at her gym, which is in another jurisdiction, and then stalking at her mom's house, which is in a third jurisdiction. So this can be helpful in gathering some of that information, as well as figuring out were there any witnesses to this particular incident, and if the police were called, was a report made. Unfortunately, what we know in some stalking situations is that that same level of incident reports doesn't happen in stalking situations as it might in domestic violence situations. And so we have to be able to change our law enforcement response to be able to figure out, are we taking reports every time we have an interaction with victims, and are we capturing that information? Because if we have it on file, then the next time something happens, then we have the two incidents that we might need to prove our course of conduct in these particular situations. So again, this log is on SPARC's website. Feel free to download it, use it, put your logo on it, whatever you want to do. And like I said, it's available in English and Spanish. One of the things that we found is it can be helpful when victims have this already in place when they're making reports to law enforcement. Law enforcement usually is going to need to go beyond just this incident log to also look at what supporting evidence they have of this particular situation, but it certainly can go a long way in helping victims gather the information in a concise way, as well as kind of putting it together neatly for reporting purposes. The other thing that we can be thinking about is stalking documentation kits. In some jurisdictions, individuals have, organizations have decided that they can put together kits that can help victims gather some of the information that they need. Now, certainly stalking is a little unique in that essentially we're asking victims to kind of build their own cases, and we don't want to put that kind of onus on victims. It's still our responsibility as a criminal justice system to be gathering evidence and moving things forward. But stalking is unique in that many stalkers are not on the scene. We're not getting a lot of information from them. And so victims are sometimes really vital in being able to gather some of this documentation. And so some jurisdictions have put together kits that include things like a cell phone, personal alarms, what we call a game camera, or cameras that can capture the offender coming onto the victim's property, that log that we just showed you, a pen that has the date and time so that when victims go to record things, or even digital recorders, depending on the laws of your state, if it's a one-party state or a two-party state, that victims might be able to use to record conversations or interactions with the offender. So some jurisdictions are putting these together and having these available at advocacy centers or at law enforcement offices, that they give these to stalking victims to assist in their ability to gather information. So it's something to think about. And last but not least, of course, the support piece of things. So understanding that victims oftentimes feel very overwhelmed by what's going on. And in fact, this victim said it's not easy to describe the fear that you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. And I've given up hope of ever having a safe life, and for the rest of my life, I'm going to be looking over my shoulder expecting to see him there. So keeping in mind that for lots of victims of stalking, that everyday reality of hypervigilance and always being worried about where the offender is going to show up is really overwhelming. And so we can talk about supporting victims in a couple of different ways. Is there a way that we can help with, friends and family and kind of cocooning the victim and keeping the victim a little bit safer in these particular situations? What kind of community services are available for our victims of stalking? Do we have things like stalking support groups in our community? Have we figured out how to do a community response in these particular situations? All of those things can help support victims as they go through this process of either enduring the criminal justice system or simply safety planning around these particular situations. One of the things that we would encourage you going forward in these particular situations is to utilize a risk assessment or a threat assessment to talk about some of the safety strategies, as well as discussing some of those safety plans with victims on an ongoing basis. As I said earlier, safety planning is a verb. It's not a noun. It's something we have to be doing on a continual basis. With stalking victims, if we do a safety plan now and the stalking is still happening 3 months from now, that safety plan might be invalid because things have changed. And so the ability to be able to be in ongoing conversations and ongoing dialogues with victims is extremely important in these particular situations. The other thing I want to point you in the direction of is some of the resources for all of you on the phone. SPARC is a part of Equitas, which is a nonprofit organization that works on all gender-based violence organizations. Many of you know it as an excellent resource for prosecutors, but we work with all different disciplines and all different crimes at Equitas, and SPARC is one of our projects. So the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center is a project of Equitas. Equitas has prosecutors who are employees who can help you build these particular cases. They can research case law. They're an excellent source of information. So if you are working on a particular case and you need technical assistance, please reach out to those of us at Equitas or at SPARC, as well as the app that I mentioned earlier, put out by our friends at the Tech Safety Group at NNEDB. This particular app focuses on all different forms of the technology that are used. It's an excellent app put out by the Safety Net team. It's absolutely free of charge in every single app store that you can access. I would highly encourage you to get it. And if it's safe for the victims that you're working with, let them use it as well. So can they access a safe computer and go there? Or if they believe their phone is safe, then they can certainly download it on their phone and they can access the information there. It's an excellent resource for safety planning and providing information about the technology portion of things. One of the things that we often get questions about is there's a national domestic violence hotline, there's a national sexual assault hotline, there is no national stalking hotline. The folks at Victim Connect are an excellent resource to be able to give to victims, and their number is up on the screen here for you. Victim Connect ends up connecting victims with a local program. So if you are part of a local program, you wouldn't necessarily need this resource as well, but it can be answered in multiple languages, and so it might be more accessible to give out. Some people in rural communities don't want to call the local domestic violence or sexual assault program because their sister works there or somebody else they know. So this is a great resource as well to be able to give to victims of stalking if they want to call and reach out. As well as the National Center for Juvenile Family Court Judges has an excellent document about how do you gather tech abuse evidence for court. It's available on their website, the ncjfcj.org website. That is part of your PowerPoint, so you can certainly look at the link and get on the link. If you have any trouble finding it, please email me and I'm happy to send it to you. But it can be really useful for guiding victims through some of the information that they might need in a civil court procedure or in a criminal court procedure. So it can just assist them in gathering some of that particular evidence, as well as all the resources that are available on the SPARC website. And I mentioned them at the beginning of the training. I want to highlight a few that I think will be helpful for those of you that are on today's webinar. The first being a whole document on safety planning. So we have a safety planning strategies document on our website. Our website's broken down into different disciplines. So there's information for victim advocates, there's information for victims directly. You will find the safety planning strategies linked in several different locations, and it's basically a some of the things that victims might want to consider when we're talking about safety in stalking situations. So I highly encourage you to get on there and print that document out. Consider giving it to the victims that you're working with. We also have general brochures on stalking, talking about what stalking is. There's room on the back of those brochures to be able to write your local advocacy agency's information. So if you're like, you know what, we don't have a ton of information for stalking victims, I'd love to be able to have some stuff out at our office. You can print some of those out. That's an excellent resource as well. Thank you, Jessica, who just linked the PDF on the chat site. I love when y'all are helpful that way. Thank you so much. The other thing is you can check out the SHARP assessment on our website as well that I talked about. It's linked there if you didn't get a chance to get the other URLs. But again, that's on the PowerPoint that you can download from this particular presentation. So please check that out as well. And last but not least, there's a guide for advocates. How do you respond to stalking? How does stalking intersect with other crimes, et cetera? So be thinking about that as well. That stalking guide can be really helpful for advocates if you have new advocates in your office, if you need to train other folks who didn't have a chance to be on today's webinar. How do we advocate for victims of stalking? A lot of what I covered today is covered in that particular document. So I really, oh, thank you. Ashley's saying she's used resources from SPARC for several presentations as well as local colleges, and says the website's super helpful and very informative. Thank you. I appreciate that. We're in the process of translating a lot of our materials to Spanish, so please, there's a section in Spanish on the website, but please look for more information coming out soon. During this very unusual time across the country, we're spending our time developing more resources. So if there's something in particular that you're really hoping would be on the website, please send us an email. This is my email address. It's director@stalkingawareness.org, as well as my phone number. Email is the best way to get a hold of me, but please check out our website. I think, as Ashley said, you might find it extremely helpful. We're trying to put up more information every single day and enhance your ability. And I would love to, if there's any I saved a whopping 2 minutes for questions. But Stephanie, if there's anything that you saw come across the chat that I can respond to, or if you have additional questions, please just email me. I know many of you are going to say, I need a certificate of attendance for this webinar. Please don't email TA to TA. They can't help you. You're going to need to email me directly. Please be patient. There's lots of you that are on the webinar, nearly 200 of you, and we have a very small full-time staff, so we're happy to provide that with you, but please give us a little time to respond to you, but email me directly instead of the TA to TA folks. And as was mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this has been recorded and will be available on our website, so if some of you were experienced static or had difficulty hearing, apologize for that. Adobe's probably a little overwhelmed right now. So hopefully the recording is clear and you can certainly listen to that on the website. So my email again is right on the screen right in front of you. It's director@stalkingawareness.org, and you can certainly reach out to us and check out our website. And with that, I'll turn it back to Stephanie. All right. I think Stephanie's having some difficulty jumping in, but we're going to go ahead and close the room here for a second. And then if you have any additional questions, please reach out to me. Thank you all for being on today. I know you have very busy schedules and lots of other things that you could have chosen to do instead today, and I appreciate you taking the time to be on today's webinar. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.